Welcome to the Friday edition of Wine's World. I'm going to conclude the story of my journey towards being a pastor and ordination. I'll touch on those topics again in the future at some point, but I want to concentrate today on what it means to be a Presbyterian and what it means to be a Presbyterian pastor. Now, a lot of people, if they're choosing a church in their adult lives, even if they grew up with one, they may find that their options are limited. Now, if you grow up Catholic, then you're going to need to find a Catholic church. There isn't a lot of choice there. Because the Catholic doctrine is pretty rigid about what you should and shouldn't do. So if you were raised Catholic and you continue in your faith, you've got to find a Catholic church. But I suppose you were raised Methodist, but the biggest, most active church in your neighborhood is Methodist or Baptist. Well, then probably most people just decide, well, what difference does it make whether I go to a Baptist or Methodist or Lutheran or Church of England? If it's Protestant, isn't it all the same? And the answer is no, it isn't. So let's journey down that path. Now, there are two big areas within church doctrine and polity and all of that that we need to touch upon when it comes to the differences between the churches. All of the present Protestant churches have different doctrines. And to a large extent, I would say that in the 21st century, those differences are getting more and more blurred. That is, if you're going to be a Protestant, you've got to accept the Trinity, you've got to accept the resurrection, you're supposed to accept the virgin birth, but there's a lot of wiggle room there, a lot of wiggle room around miracles in general, but the Trinity and the resurrection are pretty much core values, doctrinally. Now, whether or not you belong to a church that believes in a lot of liturgy, a lot of formulaic prayers and whatnot, and whether they give some kind of Mass or Eucharist or Lord's Supper every Sunday. It depends on the particular church. Most Protestant denominations don't. The Presbyterians celebrate the Lord's Supper once a month. And typically they do it on a specific Sunday, like the first Sunday, let's say. And they don't necessarily celebrate it at Easter, which you'd think would be kind of the core, because that's when the communion service was inaugurated on Maundy Thursday, so you'd think that that would tie in with Easter, but it doesn't in the Presbyterian tradition. They say, okay, first Sunday in the month, and that's the end of it. If it If it falls in or around Easter, then very good. If it doesn't, then also very good. So the Presbyterian Church is very, very streamlined when it comes to formulaic stuff. The Presbyterian Church in the U.S. Does often recite the Apostles' Creed because it's pretty central to doctrine, but not often. And the Lord's Prayer is common each Sunday, and that's about it in terms of formulaic liturgy. The Sunday service has a very rigid structure. I mean, it's loose in a lot of ways, but it's very rigid in its underpinning. So let's talk about that first. So every service that is conducted by an ordained minister in the Presbyterian tradition has to follow a generic order. And it's invariant, but extremely flexible. The reading of the Bible, which is usually referred to as the Word in capital letters, has to be at the center. And there are essentially 5 steps: 2 prior to the Word, and 2 following. So the standard rule is you gather to hear the Word, step 1. You prepare to hear the Word, step 2. You hear the Word, step 3. You respond to the Word, step 4. And you depart, step 5. Okay, well, how does that actually play out? Well, gathering, that means obviously that you come together in a place, sometimes a place of worship, but it could also be maybe a cemetery or a retreat of some sort. But you gather, then prepare to hear the Word. That can take many forms, usually singing hymns. In other words, getting yourself ready. Prayer, putting yourself into a frame of mind where you are receptive to hearing the Word. So that means you have to put aside daily things, secular stuff. You have to get yourself into a frame of mind to hear the Word. Then you hear the Word. A particular passage chosen by the pastor. In the Presbyterian tradition, the readings must be chosen by the pastor. And also, incidentally, the music, because the music is part of that process of preparing and also responding, so that the pastor is responsible for the structure of the service in general. So up to this point, all seems fairly straightforward. Sing some hymns, say some prayers, read the Word. But how do you respond to the Word? Well, that's where it gets a little bit convoluted, I guess. You must always, in the Presbyterian tradition, always, a minister who reads the Word must preach concerning the Word. That's invariant. Doesn't matter what kind of service it is. It can be a wedding, a baptism, a funeral, ordinary church service. Doesn't matter. If you read the Word, you must preach. Doesn't have to be long, but you have to preach. So that's one way of responding. Other ways include getting married. You read something about the wedding at Cana or love or whatever. You preach, and then you get married, or you celebrate communion, or you pass an offering plate, or you say another prayer. There's all kinds of ways of responding. Now, the interesting thing about sermons in the Presbyterian tradition is that they're generally what we call expository. That is, they're not homilies. They're not sort of like, well, you know, Peter did this and wasn't that nice, go ahead and emulate him. Or Jesus said, be kind to your neighbor, so be kind to your neighbor. You know, just sort of homiletic stuff. Presbyterian ministers are expected to have studied for a minimum of 7 years with a first degree, usually in some academic subject. You know, could be history, literature, could be chemistry, mathematics, law, anything. And then a second degree in ministry, theology, and so forth. In the United States, it's called a Master's of Divinity. But in England, it can be a second bachelor's degree. So you do 1 degree in, let's say, history, 2nd degree in theology, and then you do seminarian work in preaching, church organization, blah, 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 you know, all the rest of it. And then you take exams. Now, the reason for having educated pastors is a holdover from the times of Reformation, when traditionally the Catholic priests were not educated at all, and were not only not expected, were forbidden from preaching. They had the service laid out in a service book, and all they had to do was every Sunday read from the service book, which was in Latin, and many of the priests didn't even fully understand Latin, but even if they did, all they had to do was read what they were given. So the Presbyterian breakaway, which was also emulated in other circles, Baptist, Lutheran in particular, was actually reading the Word in your local language and then preaching about it in your local language, and the preacher being a highly educated person who could talk about the subject in an educated way. That's the Presbyterian tradition. It's one I grew up with, and like as well as any other. Now that's you know, like doctrine and church history, a little bit of church history. But where things get also more complicated is in terms of church structure. And Presbyterians have a long history of being unwelcome because Presbyterianism is democratic. Now, the Protestant Reformation in England was all very simple. Henry VIII wanted a divorce from Catherine of Aragon, and the Pope wouldn't grant it. And he tried all kinds of ways to get the Pope to give him a divorce, and he wouldn't. Now, what these things come down to is also very complicated, and I don't want to get into it in any great detail. But basically, if you paid enough money to the Pope, you could do anything. And one of the things that the European monarchy really didn't like was that the church was not under the leadership of the monarch, but under the Pope. So that it was the Pope who appointed cardinals and so forth. And also, in many countries, was responsible for crowning the new king. And you know that nations don't like to be interfered with this in this way from the outside. And Henry VIII chafed about it a lot anyway, because he wanted to control England in its entirety and not be beholden to Rome. And the fact that he couldn't divorce Catherine of Aragon without the Pope's approval was a real thorn in his side. And Cardinal Wolsey tried, failed. A lot of people tried and failed. And so Henry did kind of the obvious. He just said, okay, well, fine. We don't need the Catholic Church. I will just dispense with that, and I will become the head of the church. And that's what he did. So he turned the church Protestant, but in the most minimal way. Like everything about the church was exactly the same as it was under Catholic rule, except that the Pope wasn't the head anymore. Henry was. And because he was the head of the church, he could grant himself a divorce, which he did. And that's it. So the English Reformation was about as minimal as they come. Then when his son, Edward VI, took over, the reformers within the church then set to making a lot of reformed changes to the church. But then Edward died pretty young, and his sister Mary came to the throne, and Mary was Catholic, and she started executing anybody who had become Protestant. Very famous period. That's why she ended up with the nickname Bloody. She was named Bloody Mary because she killed anybody who remained in England and who has clearly Protestant leanings. But most of the Protestant reformers escaped to Europe, and they learned about many Reformed traditions that they had not understood beforehand, because Britain's an island, and the separation of Britain and continental Europe goes back a very long way. But all of these reformers had settled in places like Switzerland and met like John Calvin in particular, and his disciples, who set them on the reformed path. And then when Mary died and Elizabeth came to the throne, all these reformers came back. And one of the things that they brought with them was Presbyterianism. Now, the word Presbyterian comes from a Greek word presbyteros, which means elder. So a Presbyterian is a person who believes that the church should be ruled or governed by elders. And the way it works is that a church has a body of members, and those members at different periods in the course of the year, usually annually, elect some elders to run the church. And those elders form what is called session. And they make all of the decisions. So it's a democratically run church. Well, you can understand that with all the turmoil in England at the time, that the kings and queens of England were not thoroughly disposed to having democracy. That up to Henry and Mary and Elizabeth, certainly, the kings had used to being absolute monarchs. That is, that they had absolute power, and if they did have any kind of parliaments, which they had very rarely, they called them, and they called them for specific reasons and then disbanded them. So the power ran from the top down, as was true in the Catholic Church. The power starts with the Pope, goes down to the cardinals, then the archbishops, the bishops, and on down. That's known as an episcopal tradition, like power from the top down. Presbyterianism is power from the bottom up. The people who are in control are elected to office, and they serve the people. Now you can see that this is obviously where a great many democratic ideals in politics come from. That is, let's take the United States. A better illustration than the Parliament in Britain, because that's got all kinds of complicated history. But in the United States, the general rule is that the people elect their representatives. They have two houses, but they elect their representatives. And their representatives are the ones that make the laws. The people don't make the laws. The representatives make them for the people. That's how session works in the Presbyterian Church. The people in the church elect the elders, and then the elders make the rules. Now, and back to my ordination. The pastor of the church is what's called the moderator of the session. That means he runs the session. But he doesn't have a vote. And the reason he doesn't have a vote is that he's not a member of the church. I have not been a member of any church since I was ordained. The day I was ordained, I was struck off the rolls of the church where I'd been a member, and I became a member of my presbytery. The presbytery is the governing body of a particular region made up of all the pastors and a selection of elders from all the churches in a particular region, and they govern that region as a whole. So you can see it's power coming from the base upwards. So you may ask, well, how does the pastor get his position? And this is, I find it, quite astounding in a way. Because in an Episcopal tradition, if a church doesn't have a priest or a minister, then the bishop just appoints one. Says, okay, this church doesn't have this minister wants to move on, that's fine, and you find him a new church. But the bishop is pulling the strings from the top. When a Presbyterian minister moves on and the church doesn't have a minister, then the session gets together and decides what it's going to do. And typically they advertise the position vacant with the presbytery, and the presbytery has a list of candidates of people who don't have churches, and then the position is filled in somewhat of a similar way to the way that any kind of job will be filled. That is, that people apply for it. They don't have to just apply from the presbytery. They can apply from all over the country. And churches that don't have a minister advertise that in a national forum. It used to be a magazine, now it's done online, so that the Presbyterian Church in the USA has a list of all the jobs that are vacant, and any ordained minister can apply to any one of them. The session looks over the applicants and then makes a short list, maybe just like 2 or 3, and goes about deciding which one they would like. And it's a very, very complicated process. They have to go to where that person is at the time, and hear him preach, usually without talking to him. They just go and they listen to a sermon, go back. So they listen to a bunch of sermons, and then they say, oh, okay, we've decided that we like this one and this one. And then they eventually bring a preferred candidate to the church, and the candidate delivers a sermon, and the entire church votes on whether they want the pastor or not. It gets a little bit more complicated because there has to be an interim pastor who is directing the procedures and so forth. But the pastor is elected. Once there, it's not like they can elect the pastor out. But I mean, there are ways in which they can get rid of a pastor also. But anyway, the whole point is that it's the congregation that has the power in theory. Well, as it happens, if you're the pastor, the session by and large is going to look to you for guidance, but you don't have a vote. And as one of the things that I found very satisfying in a way is that I governed 4 churches, and I think I got better as time went on. I was not allowed ever to see anything to do with the finances of the church except the overall income and expenditures. But I couldn't even make decisions about that. If the roof needed repair, I had to go to the session and ask them how they wanted to proceed, who they wanted to contract, or how they wanted the contract to work out, and so forth. The pastor has, in a technical sense, 0 power, because the pastor's job is to preach, and the organization is supposed to be up to the congregation. And I like that. I mean, that's the way things ought to be. That if you have top-down church organization and church doctrine and all the rest of it, then it's tyrannical. Whereas the Presbyterian Church is democratic. When it is. There's an awful lot of pastors who take more control than they ought to, and so forth. But I found it a very happy structure, doctrine, and so forth, because my talent, if you want to call it that, lies in my ability to teach and preach. And that's what I like doing. And I don't like running churches. I don't like moderating session meetings. I don't like any of those kinds of things. I like singing hymns, preaching the word. And for, I guess it was, don't know, I've been ordained now for over 25 years, but for 10 years I haven't had a church. So for about 15 years I was sole pastor, and by and large enjoyed it, especially the preaching. And at some point I'll talk about my preaching, how I did it, and how it differed from the way other people preach. But for the moment, let's leave it there. Let's just think about Presbyterianism as a combination of things, of doctrine, of church structure, and church services. And if you like what I'm doing, tell your friends, like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.